Welcome all. We've got some power issues in some of our locations, so thank you for your patience. I wanted to welcome David Hinton tonight. This is the second time we've had David on this Pacific Zen Luminaries series, and David is, as you know, out with a new book. It's called Wild Mind, Wild Earth, and he has honored us with one of his early meetings. In the book tour that he's doing virtually and whatever around the country, and very excited about this book because it's about one of the most important issues we're facing today, which is the existence of the human species and how we, if we can, how we can save the earth and how we can maintain this, both this wild earth and this wild mind. And we'll go through and we'll do a few readings, and we'll do a little bit of poetry and have some Q&A through it. But first, to let people come on, let's just sit just for a minute, if we would. David writes, "We love this world, this living planet. We feel joy when life thrives, and grief when it suffers and dies. This may seem obvious and uninteresting in and of itself, but it's a mystery, isn't it? It's a mystery, isn't it?" It's a mystery, isn't it? Well, David Hinton, welcome to our series again. Very excited to talk to you tonight, not only about your new book, but also about some of the things we didn't touch on so much, like the Mountains and Rivers School, the ancient uh, roots of Chan and of Taoism. And so I'd like to hear what you might have to say about that. But I thought maybe we could just jump into the deep end of the pool to begin with, and perhaps ask you to do a reading on page 8, much more,
Okay.
and finish up the poem at the end.
All right. The book is divided in two parts. The first part, the first half, is called "How a Little Poem from Ancient China Could Save the Planet." So that's the poem I'll read these paragraphs, and at the end of them comes this poem. And that's meant to be in part serious and in part facetious, that idea that this poem could save the planet. Yes, we are much more than we think we are, and that is liberation of astounding proportions. Even simple perception, a gaze into star-strewn night skies, for instance, or stream water braiding liquid light between stones. In sight, we find that utter belonging quite literally and scientifically true. The cosmos evolved countless suns and planets. And here on our planet Earth, it evolved life forms with image-forming eyes like ours. So what else is that gaze but the very cosmos looking out at itself? What is thinking but the cosmos contemplating itself? And our inexplicable love for this world, our delight and grief, what is that but the cosmos loving itself, delighting in itself, grieving for itself? We are wild through and through, wild mind, wild earth, wild cosmos. This is how Paleolithic and ancient Chinese people understood it. And it seems clear enough, even self-evident, once we step outside the cultural assumptions we have inherited. This is our most magisterial identity, an identity that encompasses all of existence, the 10,000 things of earth and cosmos looking out through our eyes. In their expansive and ravishing dimensions, we find our kinship with those things, our love and emotional entanglement. And we also find an ethics, for what happens to earth quite literally happens to us. Who knew ethics could be so beautiful, this valuing of the 10,000 things, each in its own exquisite and individual clarity? Here it is, that ethics distilled into a simple seeming little poem of crystalline seeing that was written by Dumu in 9th century China. Egrets, robes of snow, crests of snow, and beaks of azure jade, they fish in shadowy streams. Then startling away into flight, they leave emerald mountains for lit distances. Pear blossoms, a treeful, tumble in the evening wind.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love the lines that, so what else is the gaze but the very cosmos looking out at itself? Could you speak to perhaps this paragraph and why
Yeah,
you chose this poem?
the poem, just because it's an especially beautiful imagistic poem, but it's pretty typical of Chinese poetry. So it's meant to be a typical example, just an especially crystalline and distilled example. And the seeing that we talk about in Zen, we talk about empty mind and mirror mind, all within the kind of Zen or Chan framework. But what I was describing in that paragraph is the same idea, more in our contemporary scientific language. And that is, we talk about, well, we all have Buddha nature, which is we all have empty mind, and we have it from the beginning, whether we're enlightened or not, in the sense that, yeah, we're all always already enlightened because we have that Buddha mind or that empty mind, that mirror mind. But then if you think about, for in ancient China, that doesn't mean some kind of abstract transcendental mind. What that, for them, for Chan people, this is all about, empty mind is all about reintegrating at the deepest level with the cosmos, with, you know, what they called it Tao, we would call it the cosmos natural process, or I use the word existence tissue.
Mm-hmm.
That is the cosmos seen as this living, self-generative organism. So I tried to say that in a contemporary scientific way, and in that way, we are always already enlightened because, quite literally, the cosmos is constantly in evolution and development, and what it evolved suns magically, and action in the third generation of suns. So suns, like everything else in the in Tao, which is all, Lao Tzu talked about Tao as all transformation and change as the most basic nature of things. Like the oldest philosophical book in China is the I Ching, the Book of Change. So the cosmos is in its constant transformation, has evolved 3 generations of stars. Stars have have emerged, come into being, evolved through their lives, and died. And in the 3rd generation of stars comes our sun and our planet. The planet evolves life forms. The life forms evolve image-forming eyes. So quite literally, when we look out at the egrets taking off into the mountains, or into the tree in your front yard, or whatever you're looking at, you are the cosmos looking at itself.
Mm.
And we tend in Chan and to say, well, what we need to do is empty our minds, get rid of thinking, so that you would think, okay, well, seeing is the cosmos seeing, but the next step is thinking too is. And for Chan people who were essentially Taoist rather than Buddhist, they thought the thought process to try to the idea of meditation as a kind of tamping down and snuffing out thoughts is sort of wrong-headed. That's like fighting against Tao, which is exactly what you don't want to do. So the contemporary scientific version of that is we are also the cosmos thinking itself. Every time you think about the 6th extinction coming, you're the cosmos thinking about itself. And every time we feel the 6th extinction happening, feel grief for it, that's the cosmos feeling itself. Which is kind of, someone pointed this out to me the other day, or reminded me that it's kind of counterintuitive, because the cosmos is completely indifferent, right? Doesn't care about us. And yet in us, it feels itself, and it loves itself, and it thinks about itself, and it looks at itself. So somehow it's kind of magic. It can be utterly indifferent and, passionately loving and grieving.
Yeah, that's lovely. That's lovely. When we were talking before, I really appreciate your feel for Chan, which certainly not in all literature. And I was wondering about, if you had gotten any formal training, or if you were sitting with a group or doing koan work or whatever. And you said, it's just me and the ancients. Could you, one thing we didn't really learn about you last time, tell us about how you came to be a translator, and how you became attracted to living a life of living with the ancients, working with the ancients.
Okay. Well, I started as a poet. Well, or as a philosopher. I mean, first I was doing philosophy, and I was reading Lao Tzu and some Zen texts. But then it was poetry, and ancient Chinese poetry is very much part of modern American poetry, like Gary Snyder and Kenneth Rexroth, who were California based, like you most of you. And then at some point I read that Du Fu was the greatest poet in human history, and within 1 week, for just oddly 3 or 4 times in different places, he's the greatest poet in human history, he's the greatest poet in Chinese history, et cetera, et cetera. And so I thought I would find out about it, and I was living in New York, so I went to the public library, which has one of the biggest Asian collections in the country, and read everything I could on Du Fu, and I wasn't convinced. But then one day I found a book called A Little Primer of Du Fu, which some of you might know, which has 36 Du Fu poems in every stage of of translation or of their existence. That is, the original characters, word for word, the word for word translations of the lines, line by line translation, poetic translation, and then a prose translation. So I could see all the way into Chinese language and poetry and the whole translation process as if I could read. And I sort of spontaneously started translating and realized how, from the point of view of poetry as a poet, how just the whole world that wasn't in English translations, that no one was seeing or no one was translating. So I started, hanging out there from morning until night working on this stuff. And then I went back to graduate school, learned Chinese. So I came to it as a poet, and then I just wanted to make this literature more in the mode of Snyder and Rexroth and Pound, as this literature that has these magical depths and this imagistic clarity. Also because I, from the beginning, like Snyder, was interested in this conjunction, learning from Snyder, this conjunction of Asian culture, Zen, Chinese culture, Chinese poetry, primal culture, ecology. So I was putting all those together in my way. But slowly as I was translating, sort of book after book, I'm not that smart, so it took me a long time to see this. I started becoming more and more aware of the really rich philosophical framework underneath it. And then slowly my interest sort of shifted there. So that's why I've done a bunch of philosophy books, the seminal masterworks like Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi and I Ching. And now I'm doing Zen Chan text. And I mean, so sort of to come back to part of your question was, my training or practice in Zen has been inhabiting the minds of all of these poets and philosophers who, the people who sort of invented it. Because Chan really is the framework within which Chinese culture works: paintings, calligraphy, and poetry. So I inhabit the mind of a poet for a year while I translate him. They've all been hymns because the women were all, that's, the usual monstrous story. I inhabit that mind, and that mind is kind of made out of Chan. So it's like one mind after another, a dozen, 2-3 dozen poets, and now I have a book coming out that's an kind of anthology of Chan texts from the very beginning, actually from the I Ching on. So I've inhabited all those minds, and I don't know, you learn something from it.
Yeah, it seems like you've migrated towards Chan though in your translation, your focus with China Root, and I feel like Hunger Mountain really had a Chan feeling in it without being explicit. And now you're getting more and more explicit with the gateless barrier and the like. So
yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting that it was in Hunger Mountain, which for people who don't know is the book about walking up a mountain here in Vermont one autumn over and over and over, and kind of digging into the weave of consciousness and mind. So that had a lot of Chan in it, a lot of Chinese Taoist Chan, Chinese poets and things like that. And somewhere, for some reason, I got interested in what you call the Mu koan, the first koan in the No-Gate Gateway. And so I wrote, I think part of one chapter in Hunger Mountain is about that, and then that just kind of sat there for a book or two, and then I thought, oh no, there's a lot more there. Often one of my books grow out of unfinished material in a preceding book. That was the thing in Hunger Mountain. So then I thought, oh no, I need to really go after this and where the Mu thing, which is in Chinese absence or really happens as No-Gate Gateway. So I translated that. And then I thought, well, maybe let's get more direct. And then so I wrote China Root, which goes straight at that whole Chan worldview and at the deepest level. Yeah, and I'll do some more. Hopefully I'll get back to poetry if I live long enough.
Well, we look forward to it. One thing I wanted to ask you about um, Bodhidharma, we talked about it, and
Uh-huh.
you had said that there are probably many Bodhidharmas, and that much of the Chan ethos or uh, insight really came from Lao Tzu and from Taoism in the Mountains and River School, which predated Bodhidharma.
Yeah,
Can you tell us something about that? About
yeah.
what was the
That,
world of Chan before Chan?
okay. Yeah, that's one of for me, the most exciting things about this anthology that's coming out next year is tracking these ideas. And from the I Ching and the Tao Te Ching and watch them. So the sort of the Taoist framework starts in really the Tao Te Ching. And then early around in the 200-300s, after Buddhism got here, there was a big school of philosophy that thought through the Taoist philosophy and really emphasizes cosmology and ontology, and that's called the Dark Enigma Learning School. So that established a kind of conceptual framework that all the artist intellectuals took for granted. And then, like 100 years later, two Buddhist sort of monk scholars who were also just Chinese artist intellectuals, because Chan is not like this separate world from Chinese culture. It's completely embedded in it. All the artist intellectuals knew it, visited monasteries. It was the framework within which paintings and poetry worked, like I said. So anyway, those people took Dark Enigma Learning and sort of blurred it and sort of used Buddhism to develop it some further. And one of the all-time great Chinese poets is Xie Lingyuan, who I translated a book of. Turns out he wrote an essay, which is the first identifiable Chan essay, because it talks about instantaneous enlightenment and a lot of the really basic Chan principles that we think of as coming later with Bodhidharma or the Sixth Patriarch. They're all in this Xie Lingyuan essay, and this is about 400. So this is like 150 years before Bodhidharma, the reputed Bodhidharma. So, but the interesting thing is, if you look at Bodhidharma's texts, especially the one that's the most, people say is the most authentic of the Bodhidharma texts. So here's a person that supposedly came from India and brought Buddhism, Chan or Zen Chan from India. But if you actually look at the book, the text, it's all Taoist. The two primary ideas in that text come straight out of the Xie Lingyuan essay. So whoever wrote that Bodhidharma essay had read the Xie Lingyuan essay and been hugely shaped by it. And that's just one. And throughout the Bodhidharma texts, they're just loaded with Taoist assumptions and Taoist concepts. So I say in China Root, that Chan, and this isn't really, just me, I'm not the only person who says this. Chan is really anti-Buddhist, and you can see it all over. Even Xie Lingyuan, that poet who wrote that seminal essay, explicitly goes to lengths to distance himself and he calls it like this new Buddhism, now he didn't say new Buddhism, but he says a new way of seeing, distancing it from Indian Buddhism. Yeah. And that's the assumption that Chan is a kind of reformulation of Indian Buddhism, because I think you all know Indian Buddhism came into China like first century, and then the standard line is it sort of evolved in China, and the Chan is essentially Indian Buddhism reshaped a little bit by Chinese. But I think the fact of the matter is Buddhism came in, it added a little bit, it kind of crystallized some things in that whole Taoist dark enigma learning framework, and that became Chan. So Chan is very little Indian Buddhist, so conventional Buddhist. It's almost all Taoist. They use Buddhist terminology for a couple of reasons sometimes, not actually as much as you think. They use it either institutionally to give themselves sort of the cachet of an ancient exotic foreign culture, or they use it as a way of attracting or speaking to conventionally Buddhist trained people, as a way of, talking to them in their own language. And that idea that Buddhism, that Chan is essentially just an extension of Buddhism, is also what led to a lot of mistranslation when Americans started translating the old Chan texts, because they misinterpreted a lot of things, assuming they invested the text with a lot of sort of conventional Buddhist metaphysics that isn't there. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, in your book, you make a deep dive into the argument that the paleo culture, the early paleo culture, was in many ways very different from the culture of today. So it was gynocentric. It was more in tune with the environment. It wasn't, saw animals as being really brothers and sisters, rather than later Lynn White's essay on the origins of our ecological disaster point out, and which you reference in the book. But let's read something about that, if we might, that you sort of explain on page 72, starting on the second paragraph. But as we begin to see.
Yeah, okay. But as we have begun to see, the Paleolithic survived into ancient Chinese culture, where it was refashioned to form the Taoist Chan conceptual framework. This is Lynn White's Beatnik Zen. Now, that's a kind of a reference. Lynn White wrote this essay that Jon just mentioned. And the essay says that the origins of our ecological crisis are Christianity. That is the idea that Genesis, that the planet, the earth, was given to us by God to populate and exploit, et cetera, et cetera. And then he says, and then at some point in the essay, which I read this when I was in college, and this little glitch in this essay has stuck with me ever since. And he says in it, this is written in 68, I think.
67. Yeah, I just read it last week. Yeah.
Yeah. He says, he says, so how do we solve, so he's talking about how do we solve this problem that's built so deeply into our culture? And he says, the real revolutionaries are the beatnik Zen people.
Yeah.
And it's like, but then he goes on and says, well, we can't really talk about that because they're so out there. That's not useful culturally. So he talks about St. Francis, sort of the saint who is sort of the saint of
the patron saint of ecologists.
Of ecologists,
yeah.
Who preached to the birds. That's what I was trying to think of.
Yeah.
So that's what this is talking about. So where it refashioned to form the Taoist Chan conceptual framework, White's Beatnik Zen, Chan was adopted from China by Japan, where it was known by the Japanese pronunciation of the Chan ideogram, Zen. And in fact, Taoist Chan shaped thought in a society structured very much like our own. Like us, ancient Chinese scholar officials were highly educated, empirically minded, and intensely textual. They worked in offices as government bureaucrats. They produced a complex body of cultural work: philosophy, poetry, painting, calligraphy. They inhabited large and internationally cosmopolitan cities and traveled widely between those cities, and also deep into rural and wilderness areas. All of this within a highly diversified economy with the same basic elements as ours: money, markets, agriculture, artisans, merchants, transportation, etc. Thus, unlike the Paleolithic model, the Taoist Chan framework seems to offer a more directly applicable alternative to the Western paradigm, a way of opening ourselves to our original wild mind nature, its elemental kinship with wild earth, and the ecocentric ethics implicit in that transformation. And indeed, it seems to be a fully formed articulation of the conceptual framework emerging from the conceptual transformation that has unfolded over the last few centuries in the West, and which was, like Taoism Chan, inspired from its beginnings by the philosophical insights of Paleolithic cultures. That last point.
Can you maybe talk to us about the Paleolithic culture and how it survived in Chinese culture to be of some use to us today, I think is the argument. Right?
This has been something I've loved sort of discovering over the last actually couple of decades. But so ancient China, like 2,000 or 3,000 BCE, was essentially, it was not essentially different from the Christian West in its deep philosophical structure. That is, it was a monotheism. It was it was controlled by males and a male god, and government got its power through access to that god, through supposed access to that god, and that all crumbled. And when Lao Tzu and Confucius arose, that's when Chinese were trying to rebuild a kind of conceptual framework for their culture. And I think they seem to instinctively want it to be empirically based, because both of those systems are empirically based rather than religious and metaphysical. Chinese have zero patience for metaphysics. And like the Tao Te Ching seems pretty clearly to be, it's very fragmentary. All of you have probably read it and know this. It's very fragmentary and mysterious. And it's pretty clear that it's built out of fragments from a kind of oral wisdom tradition that precedes it by probably thousands of years. And this is kind of not unusual, because the Book of Songs, which was about the same time the earliest book of poetry, was also, and we kind of know this historically, compiled from oral tradition poems that were collected and translated into classical Chinese and then assembled into an anthology of sort of people's poetry, but folk poetry. So the Paleolithic somehow survived under the surface of this, this big male-dominated power structure, and came and resurfaced. You hear in the Tao Te Ching, the Tao, which is what we could think of as the existence tissue cosmos, the dynamic, living, organic cosmos, is referred to over and over as female. Explicitly, the mother, the dark female enigma, and things like that. So it's got that old gynocentric worldview, and so that's what generated Chinese culture. All of culture, like I've said, the poets, the philosophers, the painters, the calligraphers, government officials, this was their what you would call the sort of the spiritual structure of consciousness for them. And the really fascinating thing to me is that transformation is exactly paralleled in the West. That is, we had this monolithic monotheism for a couple thousand years. And then in the Enlightenment in the 15th and 16th and 17th century, that started to crumble. And an amazing fact about that is that a, a large part of that crumbling in Europe came from Native American culture, believe it or not. There were travel books of sort of travel accounts of travels in Native America by Europeans, and also these books that were like discussions with Native American elders, like sort of debates with Native American elders, philosophical debates. And those were kind of like transcribed and published in Europe, and they were really quite popular, and they were hugely influential on a whole range of intellectuals. And the most relevant for this discussion are the British Romantic poets, Wordsworth. And the big thing that led to was, rather than the traditional European idea that we are spirits or souls, that we're radically different from the world, and the world is just this meaningless and valueless stuff for us to use. That idea, which Lynn White identifies as the root of our environmental crisis, well, that idea was challenged by all these accounts of native culture. And then the amazing transformation, which we don't even notice now, is before this revolution, the wild was considered horrible. Like I quote in Wild Mind, William Bradford off the coast of New England when he was arriving here on the Mayflower, looking out and describing what he saw as this horrible, horrible world of wild beasts and wild men, and this terrifying wilderness. He uses those words, I think, wilderness and wild. Meanwhile, at almost the same time in Europe, this transformation is happening, and you start seeing it with Wordsworth and Shelley, where suddenly they start realizing how sustaining, quote unquote, nature is. That's where they wanted to be. That nature was beautiful, and an alternative to sort of the utter alienation of the sort of industrial age cities. So that's the beginning of the whole idea we take for granted, that the Sierra Nevada are this like spiritually sustaining, essential, wonderful, beautiful thing. And then from Wordsworth it goes to Thoreau, and from Thoreau to John Muir, and speaking of the Sierras in California, John Muir and the Sierras and the Sierra Clubs starts, and then that's the beginning of the modern environmental movement. Well, so it's kind of beautiful that today's environmental movement and our whole sense that we want to protect wilderness and the environment more generally began as the back 300 years ago with Native American, essentially, philosophy, that the Paleolithic. So that's exactly the same thing that drove ancient China, invented Taoism and Chan.
Yeah,
and that's
yeah.
sort of the parallel I'm leading and I'm running and saying. So now this is the time for Chan in America, because the Chan is like the last step in that cultural transformation not in America, but in the West, in Europe.
Yeah, yeah. But in your book, you sort of bring up, I wasn't quite clear about, there's this stream, just like this parallel in ancient China after the Shang Dynasty, where, the Paleolithic stream continued on and was able to flourish. And in many ways, I think you suggest save Chinese culture. And hopefully in that same way, there's this stream, that's going through Western culture and now coming up and beginning to flower. Maybe that can too save Western culture. But you also mentioned that even parts of that stream sort of still are separate from nature. In other words, still see nature as something to take care of, to use for our own purposes, to shepherd in a sense. And as long as you look at it in that way, you know, I'm going to take care of nature and it's going to be just right. For me, in
Mhm.
a way, there's still that separation between
Yeah,
the person and nature.
it's still
That's
a kind
sort
of,
of an argument that you make. Can you
mhm.
clarify for me that?
Yeah, that's the stewardship model of environmentalism. And on the one hand, it's practical. That's the Sierra Club stewardship model. On the one hand, it's practical because it's the de facto, reality now that we do control large swaths of the planet, and either we do good things with it or bad things. But at the same time, it like you said, it retains that kind of instrumental and exploitative detachment that the West has uh, built into its cosmology, really, because we are seen as spirits that came here from our true spirit home, which is heaven, and we're playing out our what's the word, the sort of divine plan or whatever, and using nature to work that plan out. And then if we're good, we go back to our spirit heaven, or not, or we don't. And so we're here almost as aliens. And that's where that sort of exploitative distance comes from, or instrumental distance. And yeah, the stewardship thing is still the same game. It's just a little more enlightened. And so I suspect that because the underlying framework is the same, it might not be enough.
Mm-hmm.
And then I like going another level down and seeing, well, what happens if we're completely integrated, which is what Jon wants.
Yeah, yeah. You say you quote Mencius, the 10,000 things are all there in me, and there is no greater joy than looking within and finding myself faithful to them.
Mhm.
I love that line. Can we do a third reading
Sure.
if you have time?
Yeah.
This is on page 113,
Okay.
and unborn, which is that's a I don't want to say concept. That's a state. That's an expression that you certainly used in Hunger Mountain, and
Hmm.
and the characters mu or no, right?
Yeah.
And then show in Japanese show to be born, right? So
Right.
not born, and it's got in the Chinese. I find it's got a little more it's got a little more heft, or it's got a little more tooth to it, But can
Yeah.
you read this passage and talk to
Uh,
us?
yeah. I mean, just to say a little bit about unborn, unless you want to say more about it.
No, no, I
Oh,
want to
uh,
hear you.
um, because in Taoism, we think the easy way to think is to think, well, we're born out of sort of the tissue of the cosmos, and we live our lives, and then we die back into it. And that's one level of describing life. But a little deeper, we're never separate from that tissue. So and that's where unborn comes from. We're never born out of that tissue. It's a little more Taoist version of always already enlightened. We can't be separate from that tissue. So that's unborn. So here, this is a little paragraph that kind of, after some discussion of that unborn idea of the unborn. We are unborn through and through, wild mind, wholly integral to the generative existence tissue of wild earth. And accepting this engenders a new understanding of our unfolding eco-catastrophe. We can now see the sixth extinction as a completely natural event. Human depredation no different from past causes of mass extinction. Volcanoes, asteroids, glaciers, methane eruptions, gamma ray bursts. Because they occurred so long ago and did not directly impact us or the world we know, we can see those past extinction events as the cosmos sees them, with that same indifference. We accept the massive species loss as simply part of the planet's inevitable and natural evolution. And from the unborn perspective, we can see today's mass extinction event in the same way.
You're developing an idea there that I think is really essential to your discussion, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That this mass extinction in many ways is you really can't call it bad, you can't call it good. It's a mass extinction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, a little bit later, you actually say that the sixth extinction is fine, which I think in our language would be it's not, it's hard to say because it's so emotionally charged, right?
Yeah.
It's very hard to say it's okay or it's fine because immediately people are going to grab onto something, right?
Mm-hmm.
But can you talk about that quality, which I think you really communicated beautifully.
No, thank you. Yeah, that's pretty hard because that's the whole second half of the book is to try to dig into that, I guess, pretty provocative idea. But, I think once, like I said in that paragraph, once you're unborn, you can see that, well, like we were saying earlier, you are the cosmos seeing itself, thinking itself, feeling itself. Well, the cosmos, if the cosmos is what we are at the deepest level, and I think we see that in meditation practice, and Chan practice more broadly, at least for as it operates in ancient China, then our deepest self is this constant unfolding, the great transformation. So wherever that great transformation goes is where it goes, and that's its unfolding. And if it's going to go through a sixth extinction, that's where it's going. And once you're unborn, once you belong completely to it, then it's like when the asteroid hit in Mexico. It's a hard argument to develop, and then I try to cut back against it because I don't want to go all the way that way. But it is, I think it's easy to write, and there are, 40 million environmental books just talking about we're going to solve this and being all cheery about it. But I don't think many of us really believe that. I mean, I think most of us think this is pretty serious, and it's not going to go well. It's already not going well. So I wanted to dig into that and see, okay, well, if you see Chan deeply enough, or just see the nature of consciousness and cosmos deeply enough, you see, yeah, it's fine. And it's only when we see that it's fine that really we've gotten to the point that, we can actually start valuing it and doing something about it. Because then we've gotten past that kind of instrumental exploitative distance that the stewardship model has. As long as the culture has that model, Sierra Club will say preserve the mountain, and the coal company will say dig the mountain up. And there will be a debate, and sometimes one will win and sometimes the other will win. And it's pretty clear that the other side has won most of those, and they're going to keep winning most of those because that's where the money is, that's where the power is. So it's not really realistic, but the only thing I think that's really going to change that is when cultural assumptions change. And that's what I talk about all through the book. And I sort of pick up Aldo Leopold, who wrote the he's the other kind of contemporary or more or less contemporary spirit in this book with Lynn White. Although Leopold, who wrote the first time really in the West, in a philosophical sense, that the proposition that he called it the land ethic, that it's the land, the natural community is where value lies, not just the human. And that's Robinson Jeffers was doing that at the beginning of last century. And he was pretty broadly reviled for the idea that it's this magisterial living cosmos that is where value lies, not in, our little human world. And then that is the Sierra Club. It's out of Leopold, that land ethic leads to the Sierra Club. But Leopold also says, the only thing that's really going to change this is changing the basic assumptions. And he says, but I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to talk about it. And that's, our culture has completely failed at that. We have no religion or philosophy to account for that. And he leaves it at that. So in a sense, I'm like walking into that open space. I also say in the 60s, people like Snyder walked into that and tried to really developing that kind of line.
Well, Lynn White left it to the beatniks, right? So
Yeah.
thank you. We'll solve the six extinction just fine. You really love Robertson Jeffers. Could you read Robertson Jeffers? Maybe in the book. I haven't marked a specific one. Could you read one of his poems for us?
Let's see. I wonder, I can read a couple little fragments from poems that are sort of about this that I was talking about. So here's one to sort of show you what he was saying. This is 100 years ago. Integrity is wholeness. The greatest beauty is organic wholeness, the wholeness of life and things, the divine beauty of the universe. Love that, not man apart from that. So man, he's still in the sexist language, but and here's another one. And this is almost a description of, of Chan practice. We must uncenter our minds from ourselves. We must unhumanize our views a little and become confident as the rock and ocean that we were made from. So that's a little taste of what he's like. Yeah.
And you had a Wordsworth poem that you thought was pretty relevant.
Yeah. Although you want to hear that? It's a little longer.
Yeah, a little time.
Let's see if I can find it. Oh, let's see. We had.
Is that 18 or?
No.
Oh, that was coming.
$38.
38.
Thank you, Joan.
Oh yeah, well these are, I was using these, a couple of poems like this, one Coleridge, one Wordsworth, and then a little later one that's by Shelley, to sort of show you that the invention here, one stage in that transformation from like a sky god, otherworldly monotheism, and this happened fascinatingly in China and in America, is a stage of pantheism where the culture is trying to get past this sky, otherworldly sky god, trying to invest the sacred in the earth, in the, the everyday world around us. So that's pantheism. And the way, so, when all sort of, I don't know what the words are, sacred value was in God, this otherworldly God, if you want to take a step and start investing the earth, landscape, wildness with kind of supreme value. The first idea culture has, ancient China and Europe, is, well, let's make it sacred. Let's make it God. So pantheism is, the world. God is the world around us. So, and so here's this is Wordsworth sort of describing it that way. And then the world becomes magic, right? It's infused, it becomes numinous. And then the West, since that is, I think we pretty much left the pantheism thing behind, and the world is pretty much sufficient and magical enough in and of itself. And that's essentially Taoist, the equivalent of Taoism and Chan in ancient China. So this is a Wordsworth. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Therefore am I still a lover of the meadows and the woods and mountains, and of all that we behold from this green earth, and of all the mighty world. I, so long a worshipper of nature, hither came unwearied in that service. So that's, that poem is 1798, I think. Yeah, 1798. And that is really the beginning of this sense that we all take for granted. Why the Sierra Club exists, why the environmental movement exists, why we, take trips into the mountains or go to the seashore or anything. Before this, people didn't do that. They thought the mountains were this devil, the devil's playground or something like that. And they thought that wildness was something that had to be tamed and brought into God's order. Yeah.
Can I ask you to read one more poem on page 89? I love hearing you read poems, but this is First Moon.
89?
Yeah, page 89, First Moon Dufu.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I see. That was the Wordsworth you wanted me to read. You still want me to read the Wordsworth? The one before?
Oh, we got a piece of the Wordsworth.
Yeah. So this is Dufu in the 8th century. And I guess you can notice here, I put this poem in because I was contrasting it to another Wordsworth poem. And so you can see even a nature poem in the West looks very different. It still has that instrumental separation that a poem in China doesn't. So here you can just see this. So this, instead of investing nature with this kind of divinity, this is what a Chinese, quote unquote nature poem sounds like. First moon, thin slice of ascending light, radiant arc tipped aside bellied dark. The first moon appears and, barely risen beyond ancient frontier passes, edges into clouds. Silver, changeless, the star river spreads across mountains empty in their own cold. Lucent frost dusts the courtyard. Chrysanthemum blossoms clotted there and swollen dark. So the Star River is the Milky Way. But yeah, there he's like invested, everything is sufficient in and of itself, doesn't need divinity, doesn't need, this philosophical framework telling you why it's important. It's just already there.
Where was that in his life? He had a very tough life, sent off to the wars and the like. And
oh, I think that's when, yeah, he in middle age, there was just a colossal civil war broke out in China that killed or displaced like 2/3 of the population. I mean, we can't even imagine that kind of destruction. And he was from then on, he was one step ahead of that. And this, I think, was very soon after he fled. And he was on the western fringes of China, and he spent the rest of his life kind of moving along the fringes in the west and then in the south, and finally died in the south.
mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to open it up to John Tarrant and Allison Atwell if you have anything to say or to ask. Would love to hear.
Yeah, thanks, David. Um, I was it was really great hearing you read the Wordsworth alongside the Chinese classics.
Mhm.
Who's the person who did the one about the white crane and or the white egret and the pear blossoms that you began with? But
That's
who's
Dumu,
Dumu?
which is uh, the same family name. It's the same Du, but Du Fu is the first moon and Du Mu is the egret. Yeah, and he was about 100 years after Du Fu.
It's a beautiful poem. And there's an immediate, you mentioned this, but the immediacy is so striking. And that Wordsworth, there's a kind of feeling and textural quality to Wordsworth's, you know, poem, but he's still talking about his thoughts in some way
Yeah,
too.
right, exactly.
And you mentioned that too. And I like Wordsworth, but that's why I don't read him that much.
Yeah,
And I mean, I care about him. I think he did this beautiful thing, as you've said, and that I think into Chan, my understanding, like from inside the practice world of Chan, is to the immediacy of the green eye or the beak and the white feathers of the egret and the
Mhm.
pear blossoms, and that there's a certain way that life does start to hit you in the face all the time, and or like it's overwhelming. There's an overwhelming participation that happens all the time. Really,
Yeah,
one isn't that much thinking about it. It's not that thought is disapproved of. It's that one is immersed in all this,
hmm and you
and
need to see past it, right?
well, that's just like the charm thing, I think.
Yeah,
Really, and uh, and so that's kind of great. And I am kind of really struck with the idea that it never made sense to me that Bodhidharma is suddenly this Taoist sage, having come from the Indian philosophical tradition.
yeah,
I don't know how to sort that out, but you have a reasonably plausible thing is that he was already absorbed in Taoism in some way.
yeah, yeah. We often forget about the language problem too. You don't just, even today, you don't get on a plane and fly to southern China and walk onto the streets and you suddenly have this big philosophical discussion with the emperor. Which is the story of Bodhidharma. He arrives in southern China and has this debate, philosophical debate with the emperor.
Also, Chinese just doesn't. There's something disturbing about the language that's not being an alphabet language, and
Hmm.
so on. So the way it's formed, it does something different. I think it does something different in my mind, and I don't, and I think that comes through somehow I imagine the Chan and Taoism and the language sort of like they interacted in some way, because there's so much, just like a Chinese painting that's got so much space in it.
Yeah,
Do you have
yeah.
any thoughts about that, or George?
Oh, yeah. I've written a lot about that. I think that's pretty remarkable because Chinese grammar. We talked about looking at something, but John, I realize we can't because we can't show anybody those lines of Chinese.
Right.
Anyway, Chinese grammar is really wide open. A lot of the stuff in English isn't there, so that kind of emptiness of meditation is almost there in a classical poem. Like the subjects are often not there. You even usually, sometimes verbs. Certainly, all the little words that fill up our language and sort of explain everything. Like you have element A and B, and how are they connected? Well, English will say it's A and B, or A therefore B, or A but B, or A and then B, or all the different ways we can relate them. Well, China, that space where the relation is going to happen is just empty. So we kind of like fill it in.
Yeah, it's kind of
Um,
disturbing. It's both wonderful and terrifying in a way because
yeah.
he's always falling into the
Well,
emptiness.
it's fun for me because it leaves it wide open, so I get to really reinvent the poems. I can't just, it's not just, reorganizing grammar and changing, the word from, like the word for tree in another language into tree in English. It's a lot more. So here's, John and I were talking about this before, so I'll just read the, well, let me read, okay, hang on a second. I'll read a very short poem, another one that is in this book, and this one's very meditative and imagistic. Autumn begins unnoticed. Nights slowly lengthen, and little by little, clear winds turn colder and colder, summer's blaze giving way. My thatch hut grows still. At the bottom stair, in bunch grass, lit dew shimmers. So that's very much just a meditation poem. He starts out with he's so preoccupied he doesn't notice autumn, and slowly his mind settles, and then it's just mirror mind that's made up entirely of that spark of light in the grass. Well, the last line there in Chinese is literally stairs below, clump grass, sea, dew, radiance. And you can hear the emptiness in that. And the magical thing is the line see, or the word see, because there's no subject for that, right?
Yeah.
It's just see. So there's an empty space there in the middle of the line, and you kind of know it's the poet, because that's a convention. Lyric poems like this are always about the poet's immediate experience, but he's not there. So Jon empty mind, mirror mind is just there in the language, structuring consciousness.
In the koans, that's for a while, until people come to like it, that's sort of disturbing, because people want a proper subject object verb
Mhm.
in the koans. And the koans, like I'm thinking of the Kalpa fire, famous Kalpa fire koan, when the universe is destroyed at the end of this Kalpa, and then destroyed or not, like what's destroyed or not? Me, everything, anything left, that sort of thing. And it's just all dangling, and so you've got to, in a certain way, inhabit that yourself. Like, are you different from the universe? Is
Right.
Your consciousness, you're hoping will survive, or is it, you know?
Uh-huh.
So, and that's all through, like, when you look at the content, like the Blue Cliff and stuff, it's just full of that wonderful way in which it doesn't hold your hand, and you've really got to, in a certain sense, open.
Yeah.
It
Do you read
requires a certain
Chinese?
awakening to just meet it, So.
Yeah. Do you read Chinese?
No, but I've been working with a friend
Yeah.
who's a translator.
Yeah, I mean,
I got through a
yeah,
dictionary.
on the one hand, there's all that ambiguity, and at the same time, in the Blue Cliff record, over and over and over and over, it's all about dismantling whatever seems to be certain.
Yeah, all
Like,
the up and downs,
like
yeah.
very often the person who seems to be the teacher, the master in the koan, usually it's a master and a student, and the student says something dumb and the master is enlightened. Well, very often, if you're reading closely and if you're reading the Chinese, you realize, no, the student just outsmarted this guy, the master. It is, or there's the koan with a certain whatever, insight is there in whatever way the insight is there. And then there's the commentary poem, which inevitably attacks the insight and the person who had the usually a historic Chan master. Again, dismantling, always wanting to dismantle
Well,
any certainty, any claim to knowing.
Well, there is that thing in, a lot of the Chan record, where when we're not doing the usual things the mind is doing, it's not that they're bad or anything, but then something else happens where, like, it's the white feathers of the bird and the pear blossoms blowing, and you're just filled with that, and you become
Right.
rains through you. It's not out there, that sort of thing. And so that probably, I think that's where I imagine that's where the whole notion of Paleolithic connection comes from. But
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And that poem is interesting. And maybe I'll read it again. And listen what happens.
Great poem.
What?
It's a great poem.
It
It's
is.
a good choice to sort of be the axis for the book.
Yeah. It comes back. I don't know. It comes back over and over and over. But sort of notice what happens when the last line happens. It isn't just these images. There's something else happens. Egrets, robes of snow, crests of snow, and beaks of azure jade. They fish in shadowy streams. Then startling away into flight, they leave emerald mountains for lit distances. Pear blossoms, a treeful, tumble in the evening wind. So the poem has you completely enwrapped with the mountains and the egrets, and then that ends, and then there's kind of like this silence, and then something complete, and that's like this jump that you were saying, this jump of emptiness. Then there's this total jump because pear blossoms have nothing to do with what's going on in this poem, and suddenly you've jumped to pear blossoms falling, and then you.
The marvelous thing there is that in that space between the two images, and it gives you this one image of the snowy white egrets flying away, and then immediately gives you the image of the white blossoms falling, and one becomes the other in experience and in your mind. There's this marvelous melding of the disparate image and experience into one.
Yeah, because one is like a fluttering white going up and one's a fluttering white going down. Right, exactly. Yeah.
Couple things. One thing I wanted to say is you were talking about the Blue Cliff and how the teachers were constantly trying to undermine and dismantle certainty. And it made me think of your description of the unborn. And in a way, the unborn would be the experience of the unborn is the experience of uncertainty, of the unborn appearing in the moment you're in is the feeling of uncertainty. The other thing I was very struck by is that when JJ was asking you, what your affiliations were, and are you working with any, or have you working with any teachers or any Zen communities? And you said, you had a direct, you were working with the master's mind, the Chan masters themselves. And so I was thinking about your description of Hunger Mountain and how it was very much the quality of a practice, of some kind of meditative practice that you placed yourself in, or you fell into, or the mountain itself called you into this practice where you would walk up and down and meet the mountain and meet your own mind every time that you would walk it. And how the experience of Chan was actually infused in all of those elements, the mountain, your mind, and in the practice, and in the language that you were carrying with you. I just would love to hear you speak about that a little bit.
Oh. Well, to jump back a little bit, I'm not, when I say that about inhabiting those ancient minds, it's not any kind of claim of, direct transmission from the ancients. It's just kind of an empirical fact. That's where I was. That's where I am. Yeah, the mountain. I mean, yeah, it's kind of boring. You just, how boring can you be? Just walk up the same mountain, just take the same walk over and over and over. I think I've walked up that mountain at least 300 times in my life. I've been walking up it for over 30 years. Got to be an average of once a month, probably more. And somehow, because everything is known, it kind of opens your mind. Because if you're trying to orient, I feel orienting all the time. I don't know about you. Just this impulse, like almost Paleolithic impulse to orient, to know where am I? In the Paleolithic, it was, so where is fire? Where is home? Where is food? But I still feel that. So if I'm worried about orient, if I go somewhere new and set out, then I'm like, too much of me is worried about, am I going to get back in time? Where's that turn? Where am I going? So going up the mountain over and over, just the same one, is just kind of mind opening, because less and less you have to worry about where you're going. You don't have to think about that. And I don't really know how the idea of, I'm not that smart. I think when I first started Hunger Mountain, somehow, I wanted to write, I had done all these translations, and I wanted to write something, because all of ancient Chinese, all of Chan, is about immediate experience. It's all immediacy. So as long as you're just writing about it in the abstract, you're always there. That's where you always are. So I wanted to try to make a book that somehow combined the ideas with immediacy. And then, of course, mountains are the thing in China. They don't make paintings and poems about the oceans, which is kind of interesting. Almost no paintings or poems about the ocean. It's all mountains. The ocean is the other gigantic, wild presence on the planet. So I thought, okay, well, what about making it a walk up Hunger Mountain, since I do that all the time? And first I tried just as one long thing, one long walk, and then somehow it morphed into a whole bunch of little walks, so I could have, because the writing's pretty intense. People often say, oh, I can read one essay, that's all, at a time, then I have to stop. So doing it as one big book was just too intense. So I broke it up into 20 chapters or something, 20 chapters, 20 walks. Is that an answer? Or?
Can I comment, Alison?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, actually, I thought that was great, because the thing about Hunger Mountain was that it was in Vermont. And it was clearly an ordinary mountain, such as we all stroll up it.
Yeah.
We can strolls up their local little mountain, and actually we got copies and gave it to all our leadership as a New Year's gift, because it was bringing Chan home.
Perfect.
So
Good.
I very much could tell you'd probably taken that swerve before, but it's completely correct and true for it to be in China, but also it has to be here too. And I felt
that's interesting, because I did tease for a while with the idea of making it a mountain in China. But just like you say, no, it's got to be, it doesn't work that way. It would be more of an adventure story, and maybe it'd sell more books, but that's not what I wanted to. It's got to be this not terribly dramatic mountain that's right here.
But yeah, I think that's great. So, yeah. So anyway, I wanted to say that, and I can tell you're doing something in your own practice as an artist or practice as a writer with that book. It felt to me that there was some departure there that perhaps I don't understand your work well enough to know. You'd always
no. Well, that was the first book of sort of prose essays. Before then, the ideas had all been in introductions and embedded in the translations.
And they always did wonderful translations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, Alison, I interrupted you. Alison was riding a horse somewhere, and
That was great. It was great fun. One thing, when you were saying about meeting the master's minds and not wanting to feel that you had some special line to the masters or something, it was very charming. But what came to me was that when I go into an art museum, it's the same thing. I'm meeting the mind of Michelangelo when I'm standing next to the David. And it's a direct encounter in the same way that it is with the poetry, I think.
Yeah, I think that's always true for me. When I was, college age, and wandering culture, I spent a lot of time in museums, and that's what I was doing. Like you go look at, I remember Ad Reinhardt paintings, and it's like you're all the way at the bottom of Empty Mind Meditation in a Reinhardt painting, and it was somewhat intended to him, but that's true, yeah, for all paintings. And I've been talking to people lately. I don't know why it's come up a few times in ancient China. If you go to a Chinese museum, a lot of paintings, a lot of great paintings will say in the spirit of, or after, or attributed. They might attribute to a master, but they're not sure. But in ancient China, for sort of art practice, everybody copied the masters. So you would copy out a master's painting or a master's calligraphy, and it was exactly that. It was you inhabit that person's mind. It was Chan practice. And so if the original was lost, which is so often the case, very often there are these copies by especially good artists. And in the West, we would say, oh, that's just a copy. That's nothing. Because this idea that you intuitively get doesn't exist in the West. There's this authenticity of the original. But for the Chinese, it's the vision, which is embedded in landscape, which is mirror, sort of Chan mirroring is mind. So the painting itself is the painter's mind, and if you can copy that, you got the painter's mind, and that's what matters. Not, was it? And also that's interesting because of the sense of it isn't a matter of kind of Western individual identity, like the original painter and the second painter. It's because it's this empty mind is what these paintings are about, and there's no identity there. So then the idea that the copy is just as valuable as the original makes a lot more sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah, it does. Well, and what came to mind is when I was in art school, we had to copy the masters. And I was struck by how much was conveyed in how, in order to make an exact copy, I would actually have to move my brush or my hand in a way that I would not naturally have done. And it was, you definitely could feel the mind of the artist.
Yeah. It's interesting that, maybe in the West, people, that's part of art education, but people might not conceive of it at the depth that they do in the West, even though they sense it. I think, like you're saying you did, you really sense that, oh, I'm kind of in a way becoming this artist. Yes. But in China, they have this whole framework within which to understand it, which I kind of love.
David, this is a bit of a diversion, but we're getting short of time. There are great river poems in China, like Li Bai's. There's lots of great poems about the Great River and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? And there are all these ports and ancient history of seafaring, going to Africa, all that. Why do you think people didn't engage with the ocean the way?
I don't know. It's kind of $1 million question, really.
Yeah.
Well, I think maybe because the ocean isn't dynamic enough. Mountains. So I think in Hunger Mountain, I say in mountains, you can see like the energy of the earth going up and sort of seething up into the energy of sky. So there's like heaven and earth in Chinese. So there's all that energy of, and there's the energy of weather, because mountain weather is wild. So, there's the yin yang thing in China. Yang is the male active energy. Yin is the female, so more passive energy, dark energy. And rivers and mountains is the Chinese word for landscape. And rivers and mountains, the rivers are the yin and mountains are yang. Earth is yin, heaven is yang. So mountains let that dynamic interaction of yin and yang. You can see it's where you see it in landscape. So I think that's why it is. But maybe it's very, very easily understood. Still, it's, they were never, I don't know if I know a single ocean poem. You would think this massive thing, and China's got a gigantic seacoast. You'd think they would have engaged with it somehow, but maybe they operate so much within this conceptual framework that
The great poets tended to get exiled to mountains whenever they fell out of favor.
yeah they did. But well, some of them must have, there were cities on the coast, on the southern coast, they must have gotten exiled. Like actually Cialino, on the person I said wrote the seminal, the first Chan essay, he was exiled. His sort of enlightenment moment was he got exiled to the mountainous seacoast, but he was on the coast. He didn't write about the ocean though. He wrote about mountains. And that's where that's where Chan happened for him. Yeah.
Hmm. We have a couple of comments. When cloud story of Coyote, let me see. I'm reminded of the Peter Blue cloud story of Coyote undermining the certainty of who killed Coyote, ultimately claiming the kill for himself. And David, thank you. You illuminate China Root and brought it down to earth, as indeed you did.
Thank you.
John or Allison, anything to finish here?
No, it's great. I mean, I can tell how you've saturated yourself in the great work, and in a certain sense, you've become one. One becomes one of those in some way, in some very odd American sort of way.
Yeah.
It's a great thing, and I think that's what we're trying to inhabit the ancient culture, to bring it out so it comes through our hands and our minds.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. I think it needs to be living in now and not some romance of 8th century China.
Get it out of the tongue and the song.
Yeah. Yeah. When Wang Wei, the great landscape poet, was hanging out with the 6th patriarch and on and on.
Well, and thank you so much, David, for so generously giving Civic Zen another evening of yours. I know it's late for you, and it's just really kind of you to give this to us. Really appreciate it.
It's completely my honor and privilege. I'm grateful that all of you want to spend your evening. So,
thank you. Thank you very much, David. You're right. But our most elemental teacher may now be the great vanishing itself. And we've got an elemental teacher in Vermont too, as well. So thank you very much for all your hard work. And we look forward to new things coming out, as you mentioned. We'll keep in touch.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thank you all for coming.
Good night.